Aura, kindness was not admired, it was suspected. The village sat like a tired old wound at the edge of the forest, cracked by years of hunger, failed harvests, and promises broken by both men and gods. The sun rose harshly there, as if angry to see the people still alive, and it set without apology, leaving behind nights heavy with whispered regrets. Children learned early how to harden their hearts, and adults wore cruelty the way warriors wore scars, with pride. It was in this village that Obasi lived, though many would argue he merely existed. An orphan without lineage or protector, he slept in a hut so broken the wind entered freely, carrying dust, cold, and mockery. He owned no land, no goats, no future anyone cared to name. The elders called him the boy without tomorrow, a phrase spoken casually, like a fact of nature, as if his fate had already been agreed upon long before he was born. When he passed, conversations did not pause. When he spoke, eyes looked past him. In a place where survival demanded hardness, Obasi's quiet gentleness made him an anomaly, one that Ora neither understood nor wanted. Yet each morning, before the village fully stirred, Obasi rose with the first light, brushing dust from his thin wrapper and stepping barefoot onto the red earth. Hunger was his closest companion, a dull ache that never truly left, but he carried it the way he carried everything else, with silence. He fetched water from the stream for widows whose sons had died or fled, cleared stubborn roots from farms not his own, and patched leaking roofs when the rains came without asking for payment. Sometimes he was given leftovers scraped from pots, other times, only insults. Children laughed at his torn clothes and empty hands, calling him names sharpened by their parents' bitterness. Adults cheated him openly, promising food or coins that never came, knowing he would not protest. And he never did. When wronged, Obasi simply nodded and walked away, not because he was weak, but because he believed. Quietly, stubbornly. That cruelty did not need to be returned to survive. At night, when the village fires dimmed and the sky stretched wide with stars, he sat outside his broken hut and spoke softly to the heavens, telling them about his day, his hunger, his hope. He did not pray for riches or revenge. He only asked that his heart not become like those around him. He believed someone, somewhere, was listening, even if Ora never did. The village elders often said the ancestors had turned their backs on Ora, but Obasi wondered if it was the other way around. He had seen how people crossed the road to avoid beggars, how strangers were turned away with suspicion instead of food, how grief was mocked if it did not belong to the powerful. Once, when a widow collapsed from exhaustion in the marketplace, it was Obasi who carried her to shade while others complained she was blocking trade. Another time, when a child wandered lost near the forest edge, crying until fear stole his voice, it was Obasi who held his hand and walked him home, though the forest paths were said to swallow the unwary. These acts did not earn him gratitude, only more whispers. Why does he help so much? What does he gain? In Ora, goodness was never taken at face value. It was always assumed to hide something dangerous beneath. Even so, Obasi continued, not because he believed kindness would change the village, but because abandoning it felt like a deeper kind of death. And though he did not know it, each quiet act was being weighed, measured, and remembered by eyes far older than Ora itself. On the evening, everything began to shift. Harmattan dust rolled in thick and sudden, swallowing the narrow paths, and turning the sky the color of old ash. Fires flickered uncertainly as villagers hurried home, muttering warnings about spirits that walked when the air grew dry and cold. Obasi was returning from a long day of labor, his body aching, his stomach empty, when he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. A groan. It came again, weaker this time, drifting from the direction of the old crossroads where paths met and parted like undecided destinies. Everyone knew that place. It was said to sit between worlds, a spot where the living brushed against the unseen, where choices carried weight beyond understanding. Obasi slowed, his heart tightening. He knew the stories. He knew fear. For the first time that day, he hesitated. Around him, the village lights dimmed as doors shut tight, leaving the road empty. Then he saw a hand stretch weakly into the dust, trembling, reaching. Not for magic, not for power, but for help. In that moment, standing alone between fear and compassion, Obasi made a choice that would echo far beyond Ora, though he did not yet know it. And as he stepped closer,
unaware of the eyes watching from beyond the veil. His shadow stretched long behind him, dark and silent, listening.
The harmattan thickened as Obasi stepped closer, its dust curling around his ankles like a warning that still allowed retreat. The crossroads lay ahead, half swallowed by shadow, its four paths stretching into darkness like questions no one wanted answered. Stories clung to that place the way moss clung to old trees. They said spirits gathered there when the world thinned, that ancestors passed through when they wished to be heard, and that those who stopped too long sometimes return changed. Or not at all. Obasi's heart beat hard against his ribs as another groan tore through the air. Unmistakably human, unmistakably weak. He saw the man clearly now, crumpled beside the path as though discarded by life itself. The stranger was old, his wrapper torn and soaked with blood, his skin dry and cracked like earth that had known too many dry seasons. One leg lay twisted unnaturally, and his breathing came in shallow, painful pulls. Obasi looked back once, toward the village lights flickering faintly through the dust. He imagined the voices he would hear if anyone saw him stop. Leave him. It's a trap. Some burdens are not yours. Fear pressed in on him, heavy and convincing. But then the man's hand moved again, fingers trembling as they scraped weakly against the ground, and something inside Obasi broke open. Hunger, fear, superstition. All of it fell quiet beneath a deeper knowing. He knelt, ignoring the cold bite of the dust, and spoke gently, as though speaking too loudly might shatter what little life remained in the broken body before him. Villagers passed at a distance, their silhouettes hurrying along the paths, eyes fixed forward, lips muttering prayers meant to protect themselves rather than the dying. One woman recognized Obasi and hissed his name like a warning, telling him not to be foolish, not to invite what could not be chased away. A man spat on the ground and said the stranger was cursed, that anyone who touched him would carry his misfortune home. Obasi listened, nodded once, and then did what he always did. He stayed. From the small cloth tied at his waist, he brought out the only food he had been given that day, a lump of cold yam saved carefully against the night. Without hesitation, he broke it in two and pressed a piece gently into the old man's shaking hand. The man's eyes fluttered open, clouded yet sharp in a way that made Obasi's breath catch. They were not the eyes of someone defeated by life. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much of it. Obasi tore a strip from his wrapper to clean the blood, his hands steady despite the voice in his head screaming that he was crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. He lifted the man's arm over his shoulder, feeling how light he was, how close to slipping away. With slow, careful steps, Obasi turned away from the village and began to walk toward the forest path, each step deeper into a choice that could not be undone. Behind him, the crossroads swallowed their tracks, as if the earth itself wished to keep what was about to happen a secret. The forest greeted them with a silence that felt alive. Trees rose like ancient witnesses, their branches knitting together overhead, shutting out the sky. The air grew colder, sharper, and the dust thinned into mist that clung to skin and breath alike. Obasi's legs burned as he carried the weight of the old man, but he did not stop, even when the path narrowed and roots clawed at his feet. The man stirred, his voice finally finding strength enough to speak, though it came out rough and distant, like wind passing through dead leaves. He asked Obasi why he had not left him to die like the others. The question was not accusatory. It was curious, almost amused. Obasi answered simply, saying no one should be abandoned at the edge of the road. The old man laughed softly at that, a sound that did not belong to pain, and muttered words Obasi did not understand, words that made the forest seem to lean closer. When they reached a clearing bathed in pale moonlight, the man asked to be set down. As Obasi eased him onto a fallen log, the old man straightened slowly, too slowly, his posture changing in a way that made Obasi's skin prickle. The wounds were still there, the blood still fresh, but the weakness was fading, as if it had never truly belonged to him. The air thickened, and for a brief moment, Obasi felt as though he were standing at the edge of something vast and unseen, something that had been waiting for him far longer than he realized. "You have walked where others would not," the old man said, his voice no longer trembling. "You have chosen what costs you, when there was nothing to gain." He rose fully now, standing taller than before, his presence filling the clearing in a way that made Obasi's shadow stretch and twist across the ground. Fear finally found Obasi's chest, sharp and undeniable, but he did not run. He bowed his head, not in worship, but in respect, the way one did before truths too large to argue with. The old man's gaze softened, and for a fleeting second, Obasi saw something ancient flicker behind his eyes. Ages, seasons, countless crossroads remembered, kindness,
The man continued, "is never unseen. It only waits for the right moment to speak." Then, stepping back into the shadows between the trees, he delivered the words that would follow Obasi for the rest of his life. "Your kindness has been seen. What follows you will speak louder than your voice." Before Obasi could ask what he meant, the forest exhaled. The mist thickened, the moonlight dimmed, and the old man was gone. As though he had never been flesh at all, alone in the clearing, heart pounding, Obasi turned toward the path home. He did not notice at first that his shadow lagged behind him, lingering a moment too long in the moonlight, as if listening, as if remembering.
Morning broke over Umuora with a quiet wrongness that only a few noticed at first. The sun rose as it always did, but its light seemed to linger strangely on certain places, touching some compounds longer than others, as though deciding where to rest. Obasi returned from the forest before dawn, dust-stained and exhausted, the events of the night clinging to him like a half-remembered dream. He told no one what had happened at the crossroads. In truth, he barely understood it himself. He washed his feet at the stream, unaware that the water lapped higher around his ankles than it had in months, or that fish stirred where none had been seen since the last dry season. When he passed through the farms later that morning to begin his usual work, leaves brushed his arms heavy with dew, and yam vines that had struggled days before stood suddenly upright, thick and green. Farmers noticed by midday. By evening, whispers followed him the way his shadow always had, except now they carried confusion instead of indifference. A woman swore her cassava had doubled overnight after Obasi helped her clear weeds. A hunter claimed he found his way home after getting lost because he had crossed paths with the boy at the forest edge. Even Obasi noticed the change when the dry stream near his hut murmured softly, water creeping over stones long exposed to the sun. He stood there for a long moment, heart tight, unable to explain why hope and dread rose together in his chest. As days passed, the village shifted. Children who had gone missing while playing too close to the forest returned unharmed, babbling stories of being guided back by a familiar voice they never quite saw. An old man who had not spoken since the death of his wife suddenly laughed in the marketplace after Obasi greeted him, startling everyone within earshot. These things should have inspired gratitude, but Umuora had learned long ago that good fortune always demanded payment. At first, people smiled cautiously at Obasi, offering food more generously than before, nodding with a respect that felt foreign on their faces. Then the questions began. Why him? Since when does kindness bend the world? Elders gathered beneath the Inuku tree, their brows furrowed, speaking in low tones about balance and unseen debts. Obasi felt their eyes on him wherever he went. And then there was the shadow. It no longer obeyed the simple rules of light. Sometimes it arrived before him, stretching across doorways and paths as though announcing his coming. Other times it lingered long after he had passed, dark and unmoving, even when the sun shifted. A child screamed when he saw it bend where Obasi did not. A woman dropped her pot when the shadow seemed to turn its head. Obasi himself noticed it one evening, watching it pool strangely at his feet while his body stood still. He said nothing. He did not know how. He only felt the weight of the forest silence pressing closer, as though waiting for the village to decide what his blessings truly meant. Suspicion ripened into jealousy the way fruit ripens into rot. Neighbors who had once ignored Obasi now watched him with narrowed eyes. Men whose farms still struggled spat his name as they passed, muttering that some people prospered by stealing from others through unseen means. A healer accused him of upsetting ancient balances. A trader whispered that no good ever came without blood behind it. Obasi tried to keep to his routines, believing the village would remember who he had always been. But memory is fragile when fear sharpens it. The turning point came swiftly and without mercy. One night, a fire broke out in the compound of a powerful chief, destroying his storehouse and leaving his youngest son injured. The village woke to screams, drums pounding in alarm, and by morning, blame was already being shaped like a weapon. Someone pointed out that Obasi had passed near the compound the evening before. Another said his shadow had been seen stretching toward the chief's land. By midday, the murmurs had hardened into accusations. Obasi stood in the marketplace as voices rose around him, louder and angrier than he had ever heard them. He opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. He had never learned how to defend himself against hatred. Silence had always been enough. This time, it was taken as proof. Fear fed on itself, growing bold. Stones were thrown. A woman screamed that he was a witch, that he had fooled them all with false kindness. Obasi backed away, heart hammering, his shadow flickering wildly at his feet, stretching and recoiling like something struggling to break free.
By sunset, the elders had decided. There would be a trial at the ancient shrine, where truth could not hide and spirits were forced to speak. Drums announced the summons, their rhythm heavy with finality, echoing through the village and into the forest beyond. Obasi sat alone outside his hut as the sound reached him, the same stars overhead that had once felt like silent friends now watching with unbearable intensity. For the first time since he could remember, fear outweighed hope. He wondered if kindness had been a mistake, if the village had been right all along to harden their hearts. As he rose to follow the drummers, his shadow stretched long across the ground, dark and trembling, its edges sharpening as though gathering strength. Obasi did not notice when it failed to mirror his steps exactly, lagging half a breath behind. He did not see how it swelled and deepened as the shrine came into view, fed by the growing anger of the crowd. But somewhere between the drums and the incense, between accusation and judgment, the ancestors stirred. And the village of Umuora, so certain of the boy's guilt, had no idea that the truth they demanded was already standing among them, listening.
The ancient shrine of Umuora had not tasted judgment like this in generations. It stood at the edge of the forest, carved from stone darkened by age and sacrifice, its walls etched with symbols older than the village itself. As night fell, torches flared to life, their flames licking upward like restless tongues, casting long, trembling shadows across the clearing. Drums thundered in a slow, relentless rhythm that vibrated in the chest, summoning not only the living but everything that had ever listened from beyond. The air was thick with incense and expectation, sharp with fear disguised as righteousness. Obasi was dragged forward and made to kneel at the center, the red earth cold beneath his knees. Around him, the villagers gathered in a wide circle. Men, women, children. Faces hardened by suspicion, eyes gleaming with the dangerous satisfaction of having found someone to blame. The elders sat elevated on carved stools, their expressions solemn, their hands resting on staffs that symbolized authority passed down through bloodlines and secrets. The chief whose household had suffered sat apart, grief twisted into anger, his gaze fixed on Obasi like a spear. The high priest stepped forward, his voice rising above the drums as he called upon the ancestors to witness the trial. Obasi listened, his heart pounding, his mouth dry. He had no defense prepared, no clever words, only the truth of his life, which he was learning meant very little when fear had already made its decision. As the accusations poured forth, each one sharper than the last, Obasi felt himself shrinking inward. They spoke of shadows that moved unnaturally, of blessings that came too easily, of fires and misfortune laid at his feet without proof. Each claim was greeted with murmurs of agreement, nods that hardened into certainty. When the priest finally turned to Obasi and demanded that he speak, the clearing fell into a heavy silence. Every eye pressed into him. Obasi opened his mouth, but his voice faltered, swallowed by the enormity of the moment. He tried again, whispering that he had done nothing but help where he could, that he did not understand what was happening to him. Laughter rippled through the crowd, bitter, cruel. Someone shouted that witches always claimed innocence. Another demanded blood to appease the gods. The drums grew louder, faster, feeding the frenzy. Obasi bowed his head, tears burning behind his eyes. And for the first time since childhood, he wondered if the village was right, if his quiet refusal to become cruel had been foolish. And then the firelight shifted. A ripple moved across the ground, subtle at first, like wind through tall grass. Obasi's shadow, stretched long behind him, began to darken, its edges sharpening against the earth. It pulled away from his feet slowly, deliberately, as though obeying a command older than fear. Gasps tore through the crowd as the shadow rose, swelling upward, thickening into a shape that stood upright before them all. The drums faltered, then fell silent. The shadow stood where Obasi's voice had failed him, tall and unmistakable, its form both familiar and terrifying. Firelight passed through it without warmth, and yet it cast a presence so heavy the air itself seemed to bow. Children screamed, elders recoiled, clutching their staffs. The priest staggered back, his chants dissolving into incoherent whispers. Then the shadow spoke. Its voice was not loud, but it carried, rolling through the clearing like wind through ancient trees, layered with echoes that did not belong to one throat alone. It did not plead. It did not beg. It judged, one by one. It named what had been hidden. It spoke of lands stolen by elders who preached fairness. It spoke of blood debts buried beneath ritual and silence. It named the chief's crime, how his greed had driven the forest back, how his own negligence had sparked the fire he now blamed on another. Each revelation struck like thunder. People cried out, covering their ears, falling to their knees. The elders' faces drained of color as secrets spoken only in darkness were dragged screaming into the light. The shadow spared no one, not even those who had mocked Obasi's kindness while quietly benefiting from it. With every truth revealed, the wind rose, torches flickered violently, and the shrine seemed to pulse, alive with ancestral fury. Obasi knelt, unmoving, tears spilling freely now, not from shame, but from awe and terror. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted power. Yet here it was, standing in his place, speaking the truth no one else dared. When the shadow finally fell silent, the clearing was unrecognizable. Strong men wept openly. Elders lay face down in the dirt, their authority shattered. The priest trembled, unable to meet anyone's gaze. For a long moment, there was only the crackle of torches and the sound of ragged breathing. Then the shadow turned, slowly, deliberately, and faced Obasi. Its form softened, its edges loosening as though the storm had spent itself. Without another word, it sank back toward the earth, folding seamlessly into Obasi's feet, becoming once more what it had always been. The night exhaled. Fear gave way to understanding so heavy it hurt. The crowd looked at Obasi differently now. Not with suspicion, not with contempt, but with something far more unsettling: humility. The priest dropped to his knees and declared the boy innocent, blessed, chosen. Voices rose, offering wealth, land, even kingship as apology and appeasement. Obasi lifted his head at last, his face streaked with tears, his eyes steady. He did not smile. He did not accept. He only stood, the drum silent, the ancestor satisfied, for now. And as the moon climbed higher, one truth settled into Umuora like a scar that would never fade. The boy they had tried to destroy had never needed to speak at all. The truth had been walking behind him all. Came to Umuora slowly, as though the sun itself needed time to decide whether the village deserved another day. The shrine lay abandoned now, its torches burned down to blackened stubs, the air still heavy with the scent of incense and exposed truths. People returned to their homes in silence, walking past one another without the usual sharp words, their eyes lowered, their steps unsure. The events of the night clung to them like ash that could not be brushed away. Children whispered questions their parents could not answer. Elders locked themselves indoors, stripped of the certainty that had once wrapped them like armor. At the edge of the village, Obasi sat outside his broken hut, watching dawn spill gold across the red earth. His shadow rested quietly at his feet, ordinary once more, unmoving, as though it had never risen to speak. He felt no triumph, no swelling pride, only a deep, aching weariness. The village had called him powerful, chosen, dangerous. None of those names fit. He was still the boy who fetched water, who slept hungry, who believed kindness mattered even when it hurt. When messengers came with gifts, yams, cloth, coins, goats, he turned them away gently, thanking them with a bowed head. Their offerings felt heavy, as if accepting them would weigh him down with the very thing that had poisoned Umuora for so long. What the village needed now, Obasi understood, was not another figure to fear or worship, but a reminder of what they had forgotten how to be. By midday, the elders gathered again, humbled and uncertain, and asked Obasi to speak. Not as the accused this time, but as the one who had survived their judgment. They offered him land, authority, a place among them, believing titles could mend what shame had torn open. Obasi listened in silence, his gaze steady, his hands resting loosely at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unraised, yet it carried in a way that made people lean closer. He said he wanted no throne built from fear, no wealth born of guilt. He reminded them that power had not saved them from themselves, and that the ancestors had not spoken to elevate one boy, but to correct a village. His single demand fell into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. No orphan in Umuora would ever sleep hungry again, and no stranger would ever be turned away without food and shelter. There were murmurs at first, unease, resistance, but they faded beneath the weight of what had been revealed the night before. The elders agreed, their voices subdued, and for the first time in memory, a decision was made not for control, but for care. Obasi did not stay to receive thanks. He returned to his routines, helping rebuild what had been neglected, offering labor where it was needed, his presence steady and unremarkable. Slowly, the village changed, not through magic, but through choice. Fires were shared. Doors stayed open longer. People began to look at one another again, really look, as though seeing for the first time the cost of their hardness. Seasons passed, and Umuora prospered in ways no charm could have forced. Crops grew steadily, not miraculously,
but reliably, nurtured by cooperation rather than envy. Children laughed more freely, their games spilling into paths once avoided. Travelers spoke of the village where strangers were fed without question, where orphans were raised by many hands. Obasi remained at the edge, never stepping into the center of attention, never claiming credit. His shadow followed him faithfully now, ordinary and obedient, stretching and shrinking with the sun like any other. And yet, people never forgot what they had seen. On nights when the moon was full and silvered the earth, elders spoke in hushed tones of the shadow that had stood upright and spoken truth. They warned their children that injustice had a way of leaving footprints, even when hidden, and that kindness, once witnessed by the ancestors, could never truly be silenced. Obasi himself rarely spoke of the past. When asked, he only smiled softly and said the village had taught itself a lesson it would not soon forget. He aged quietly, his hair graying, his back bending under honest labor, respected but never exalted. And if he ever wondered why he had been chosen, he kept the question to himself, content with the work of each day. Long after Obasi was gone, when his hut had returned to dust and his name had become part of story rather than memory, Ora still remembered the night the truth stood up to speak. Elders claimed that sometimes when injustice stirred, when greed crept back into hearts, or when the weak were mocked in the marketplace, a shadow would linger too long at the edge of the firelight, dark and watchful. It never spoke again. It did not need to. The people had learned to listen. And so the village endured, not because of fear of spirits or hope of blessings, but because one boy, forgotten by all, had chosen compassion at a crossroads where it was easier to walk away. In Ora, they say the ancestors do not always speak with thunder. Sometimes they follow quietly behind those who refuse to harden their hearts, waiting, watching, ready to speak only when the world forgets what kindness sounds like.
What did you get to learn from this story? Kindly drop your thoughts and questions below. Do well to hit the subscribe button to see more emotional and exciting stories like this on Folktales by Siri.